Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. We're here for our weekly review. In domestic politics, Donald Trump won the Iowa caucuses, but the turnout was really poor, and that suggests something that I think has been lost on the mainstream media. As popular as he is with his core base, it doesn't mean that that base has gotten any bigger, and in fact, I would argue it's shrunk. The number of people who absolutely believe in Donald Trump, who will crawl through the snow to vote for him, is perhaps smaller than they have anticipated. 56,000 or so people voted, but in a state of millions? And let me say, in 2016, when he was running for the first time, he got 45,000 votes before he was president and with a very crowded field. So is 56,000 really a great result? I don't think so. And that doesn't mean he's not going to win the nomination. I think it's very likely he will. But it does mean that I think the whole Trump phenomenon has been perhaps overestimated. We've gotten so used to being concerned that we've missed something, that we're not aware of the danger, that there is a danger in overcorrection, in building him up to be something much larger than he is. Now, Nikki Haley is hanging in there. She's going to be the primary opposition in New Hampshire. But if she doesn't win, what's the point? Why would she carry on? So in less than a week, I think we're going to know if the nomination is essentially over. Now, that raises an interesting issue, and it has to do with Donald Trump's trials. We know that he was already found liable in one E. Jean Carroll case. There is another one going on, and in the meantime, he's finished with a third trial. That was the New York case involving the inflation, the exaggeration of his financial properties values. And something is very interesting in all three of these. I wrote about it in the Post. Shameless plug. Go take a look. Donald Trump is incapable of controlling himself, even when a jury is present, even when it's not in his interest. And as a result, he does what he always does. He has a temper tantrum. He mumbles. He gets chastised by the judge. He crosses his arms and pouts. And let me tell you, that's not the good way to win over a jury. A jury wants someone who at least respects them and respects the process. So I think Donald Trump, when he goes in front of a jury for a criminal case, is going to have a little bit of a problem. He is, as George Conway, who's been on our show before and who is a fine lawyer and knows Trump's psyche better than anyone else, has often pointed out, he's a psychopath. And psychopaths cannot control themselves. They don't really plan. They simply react in the moment. There's no strategy to this. There is, in fact, a vivid portrayal of why he is so unfit for the presidency and why these trials, these criminal trials, are very likely to result in convictions. And we have two of them that are more likely than not going to happen before the 2024 election. One is the New York trial involving Alvin Bragg, and the other, of course, is the D.C. case involving January 6th. And when a jury gets a hold of this guy and they see him frowning and pouting, and then you're going to see, I think, convictions. And put those two things together. He's going to be the overwhelming favorite, most likely, for the nomination, and then he gets convicted in one or more of these cases. What happens then? Does the Republican Party simply go down with the ship, hoping that a majority of Americans, or at least a majority of Americans who make up an electoral college victory, are simply going to accept someone who has been convicted for multiple crimes? I guess they'll have to. And who would be his vice presidential pick? You could imagine him picking someone who makes Sarah Palin look like Thomas Jefferson. You can imagine him picking a Kristi Noem or somebody even worse, a Marjorie Taylor Greene. And when the public looks at that and they say that's the alternative if Trump cannot serve, if he's in jail, or if he has his own health problems, what are they going to make of it then? So I think once again, we have missed some of the problems, some of the burdens that Trump carries. The press is so used to finding fault with President Biden. He's old. The Democratic Party would like somebody else. He doesn't seem very dynamic. That I think they've made up a lot of artificial deficits for him to try to counteract Trump's very real, very big deficits. And when you get that into an actual election with actual voters, I think you're going to find that the Republicans get their comeuppance. Now, there are a couple other things going on. One is we've had yet another one of these special elections. This was a state legislative seat in Florida, in the 35th district, that flipped from Republican to Democrat. Another special election. And there have been a whole slew of them over the last few years. And frankly, the vast majority of them have gone from red to blue. So there seems to be something going on out there. Perhaps a lack of enthusiasm among Republicans. Perhaps a determination by Democrats that this has got to end. This insanity has to be put behind us. So stay tuned. I think we have more to be optimistic about than not. And by the way, it's not a bad thing for the Democratic electorate to think that they're behind. You never want to be overconfident, which is what happened, I think, in 2016. You want people to have a sense of urgency, a sense of concern that our democracy might be at issue, because it will be at issue. And we're not out of the woods yet. Now, meanwhile, the U.S. Congress, what can you say? At least the House Republicans have, it seems, agreed to pass another continuing resolution that'll get us to early March. So once again, we don't shut down the government. But these people are obviously continuing to fight themselves and to look like a bunch of clowns. They're unable to come up, at least as of this recording on Friday, with a deal on the border and on aid to Ukraine, which would be a disastrous result if we leave Ukraine twisting in the wind. And they can't really make the government operate unless the Democrats are there to do it for them. So what's the argument for re-electing them? I don't know. I don't think there is one. So they're having their work cut out. And meanwhile, the Middle East. I had a fascinating meeting on Capitol Hill on Thursday with two families, both of whom have loved ones who are still held hostage. It is a heart-wrenching experience to sit down with these people. And you can see in their eyes and their body language an utter despair, an utter darkness, a sense of almost agony that their loved one is gone. In one case, one of the families has no idea what the physical condition of the young woman is, 30 years old. Doron, she is a vet tech. She loves animals. She loves kids. They've heard nothing from her. They haven't been able to identify her by any of the other hostages who have since been released. Imagine not knowing for over 100 days whether your daughter is alive, is dead, healthy, not healthy. Her mother said she's very much aware of the instances of sexual violence both before and after the hostages were taken. And she says very simply, I worry about her. She's a young girl. Now, you have to have a heart of stone. You have to be really a psychopath not to understand the depth of that agony that that mother is feeling. Now, how does this resolve itself? And what do the hostage families really want? I think something interesting is happening in Israel, and that is the anonymity of the hostages has ended. They are real people. They are fellow friends, neighbors. Israel's a very small country, so people take this very personally. People are 1 or 2 degrees away from anyone who has served in the military, who's been killed, who's been kidnapped, who's had a loved one who's been kidnapped. It is a very tight bond. These are not simply names on a poster in a country of 9 million people. And I think the sentiment has shifted dramatically. There was already huge antagonism towards the Netanyahu government. They've lost faith in his ability, first of all, to protect them, second of all, to come to the aid of the population once the attack happened, and third of all, there's been a complete breakdown in social services. So whether it's housing or food or medical care, that is being provided to the many, many people who need help right now in Israel by civil society, by groups of people, by the people who were marching in the street for democracy. So the government has fallen into really disrepute, and only about 15% of the people support Netanyahu, which is almost unheard of. And there's a growing sense that he is an impediment to getting the hostages back. He's an impediment to finding an end to the war that will nevertheless respect Israel's security needs. And he is obviously an impediment to a larger peace. And he delights now in thumbing his nose at the United States and declaring he'll never accept a Palestinian state. Well, I never thought I would say this, but I think it's time to begin to get tough with him. I think it's time for the United States to make clear that our aid is dependent upon their cooperation in a reasonable, peaceful resolution. And you know who would support that position? The Israeli people. Biden has a very special bond with Israelis, having come to their aid, having expressed so poignantly his own Zionist sentiments. They trust him, they respect him, and I think he's more in touch with the sentiment there than Bibi is. And I think we're getting close to the time where perhaps a nice speech would be in order, in which he says, listen, the majority of the fighting is done, and in fact the intensity of the fighting has been reduced now that they're in the south, or essentially in mop-up operations. It's time to get the hostages back. It's time to bring this to the end. And yes, the United States and the neighboring Arab countries stand in favor of a two-state solution. And that's where we're going to have to go. We're not going to get there tomorrow. We're not going to get there in a year or 2 years. But that's the direction we're going to go, because otherwise, all you have is one October 7 after another. Death, destruction, agony, the sight of more hostage families, and that has to end. So I think we're getting close to that point. I think Bibi now is completely reverted to his me at all costs sort of presidency, the prime ministership. Reminds you of somebody closer to home, where it's all about him. It's not about the good of the country. It's about his own political survival. It's about his own ego. And I think the United States has got to really step in a more forceful way than we have before. Because as we've seen, what happens in Israel does not stay in Israel. We've now had to retaliate against the Houthis. The Pakistanians and the Iranians are exchanging missiles back and forth. We have the capacity now. We are in a position that we may have a much larger regional war that is not in our interest, not in Israel's interests. And if Bibi is indifferent to that, then he's a problem. Then the United States has to act in ways perhaps which we haven't in the past. So it's a very, very delicate dance. And I think what impressed me most this week in seeing these families is the lack of anger, the lack of animosity towards the Palestinians. In contrast to the crowd who screams, make the Intifada international, crowd who says from the river to the sea. These people are not filled with hate. They don't want revenge. They want their people home. And in fact, they are probably the best examples of people who are farsighted enough to know that they want a future living side by side with the Palestinians. It's interesting, the people on those kibbutzim in the southern part of Israel, were many of them involved in the peace movement. That's where the peace activists live. They wanted to live close to Gaza. That was their choice. They were activists. They were social activists. And many of those people took enormous losses in the massacre that happened on October 7. But the response is not anger. The response is not hatred. And boy, is that a model for all of us. Having experienced the worst of the worst, their moral and their emotional and their intellectual energy is not spent on revenge or hatred or, as the International Court of Justice so grotesquely asserted, on dreams of destroying another people. It's focused on peace. And what a powerful message that is. What a beautiful message that is. So if you believe in prayers, pray for those people. And if you believe in political action, pick up the phone or write an email to your congressman and say, enough is enough. It's time to bring the war to a close. So we live in interesting times, dangerous times, but I am more optimistic that here at home, the American people are on to Donald Trump and the court system will deal with him. And internationally, if we can get Congress, specifically the House Republicans, to finally act in Ukraine's defense, I think we will maintain our status as the indispensable nation, the nation that stands up for democracy. That's a big responsibility, but I actually think we're up to it. So, if you enjoyed this program, if you enjoy our other programs, please tell your friends. They can follow us. They can subscribe on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.